So since we did a brief history on wrestling, I'd like to do one on boxing as well. And this one's actually going to be probably even a little bit quicker and a little dirtier. One, because there's less to tell, and two, because if I really got into some of the nitty gritty, it would get a little out of hand. So, okay, what does boxing even mean, right? Boxing comes from a potentially unknown, right? It's of uncertain origin, but they think it may come from German, Dutch kind of word that means a blow, to strike with the fist, right? To strike in general. And so that distinguishes the concept of striking from wrestling. And as we talked about in our wrestling video, there was wrestling for play and wrestling in earnest. And so if you're talking competing, if you're talking about play, wrestling generally did not involve any striking. And if you're talking about, serious wrestling, right, which would be self-defense, street fighting and whatnot, that would start involving striking and weapons. So where do we see boxing start coming up? Well, our most ancient source is in Sumeria, modern-day Iraq, and that's from the 3rd millennium BC, so not quite as old as wrestling as far as our depictions go, but still pretty old, right? And we can kind of surmise from that kind of people have been fist fighting for as long as there have been people. I mean, we've even seen great apes fist fight, and so it kind of seems to go back to just that dominance game kind of thing. And from there, we do have old depictions of fist fighting in Asia, right? India and China in specific. And then everybody knows that the Greeks like to box. In fact, the Greeks had grappling competition, boxing competition, and pancration, which was their MMA. We don't know much about the rules. There's a serious lack of documentation. A lot is found from pottery shards and kind of third-party correlative sources. So we don't know much about the rule sets they use, but it does seem that they kind of separated their striking and grappling practices. So that's what we can say about the Greeks. Now, when you think about boxing in the modern day, right, what do you think about, right? You think about the big gloves, the silk shorts, the ring, 12 rounds, no kicking, no grappling, right? Only punch with the front of the glove, that kind of stuff. Well, it turns out that's actually very, very modern, right? That is almost 20th century, late 19th century, almost 20th century modern. And so before that, boxing actually was not just a fist fight, but it involved grappling in some limited capacity, just like serious grappling involves striking in some limited capacity, right? It's almost the inverse. And so, right, if we go back before Broughton's Rules, right, so Broughton's Rules came around in 1743, we go back before Broughton's Rules, we do actually have at least one source. It's about Cornish, is called Cornish hug wrestling or the in play, something like that. And there's like a paragraph dedicated to boxing, and it talks about hair pulling and eye gouging and soaping your hair so that your hair doesn't get pulled as much. I mean, we're talking like dirty boxing. They were absolutely talking about it in the context of inside grappling. They were talking about it in the context of just fighting, not what we think of as boxing. And yet they called it boxing. They didn't call it pugilism. Pugilism is a word that kind of came up as a flavor text word from time to time. You see boxers refer to pugilists more often, but you don't actually see boxing referred to as pugilism that often. So it really, really bugs me that the HEMA community is trying to push the term pugilism as a way to differentiate it. It was called boxing from the earliest references that we have to it as far as English boxing is concerned. Let's call it boxing. Just call it old school boxing, call it HEMA boxing, whatever you want to call it, but it's boxing. Anyway, I'm gonna get off my soapbox then. All right, so what happens in 1743? Well, just before that, guy dies in the ring. Broughton goes, well, we can't have that. And so he crafts some rules to protect the fighters a little bit more. And this is where we start seeing no striking or grabbing below the waist. Everything is waist up. You don't strike a man when he's down, and no dirty fighting, no eye gouges and headbutts. Essentially, giving us kind of the platform for the rest of it. But there was no prohibition against kicking, and there was no prohibition against grappling. Just no ground fighting and no dirty fighting, no dirty boxing. Then in 1838 and later in 1853 with a revision, they decided to come up with the London prize ring rules. And this was done more by committee as opposed to done by a single guy. And they expanded the rules from like 7 to something in the realm of like 28. The revision added a couple more. And they just further clarified these things. And some people like to say, well, this is when they prohibited kicking. But the one rule, which I think is rule number 14, off the top of my head, I might be wrong on the number, but there's only one rule mentioning kicking, and it mentions it in context of you don't kick a man when he's on the ground. And so in some sense, it's just a redundancy of you don't attack a man when he's down. But it doesn't seem to outright prohibit kicking. And people quibble about that question over that. I personally think that may go back to, again, the way that purring had been involved. Purring is a kind of backhold and shin kicking kind of thing. And eventually that got kind of lumped in with thuggery, and purring started being used at some point as slang for just kicking a person when they're down. I mean, we're talking like it's synonymous with thuggery. And so in general, I think that the British distaste for kicking may be more in the vein of that's thug stuff. Some people have said, they think it's due to the rivalry with the French, and because the French did kicking, the English didn't prefer it. The problem is that like savate was just being invented around the time that this was coming into, and early savate was primarily low kicks. So maybe the English were just saying, look, we're not attacking the lower body, so let's just not do that. Maybe they just didn't conceive of people throwing high kicks. I don't know. Either way, the English didn't prefer kicking, and yet the rules only really kind of specify no kicking a man when he's down, no striking below the waist, no dirty fighting, that kind of stuff. But in the prize ring rules, it went clear all the way through 1867 when the next rule set came in. They still allowed grappling. They still allowed holding and throwing. You could hold a guy and hit him. You could hold a guy and throw him. And they still allowed that. Then you get the Queensberry Rules. Queensberry Rules, invented by J.G. Chambers, the same guy that gave us the catch wrestling rules. And that's when they standardized rounds, added gloves as a standard, took out all of the grappling, absolutely prohibited, kicking, all the other stuff, right? And that kind of gave us a platform for modern boxing, the boxing that we think of. Modern boxing is really just kind of a further adaptation of the Queensberry Rules. A few years ago, the ABC even created a unified rule set for boxing because different federations had slightly different conventions. So that's kind of that progression right there. So, I mean, hey, look, modern boxing is fun, it's cool, and you can learn a lot from it because when you really restrict people and make them specialized, they come up with some really interesting things that you just won't or can't do when you are more generalized. So there's nothing wrong with modern boxing, but my interest is in the older styles. Let's go back to Asia for a second, right? So remember how we mentioned that the Greeks had kind of like boxing and wrestling, and then they had pancration, which mixed the things? Well, we look at Asian martial arts, Asian boxing methods, right? Whether we talk about the historical record of Indian fist fighting styles, or what's more commonly thought of as Chinese fist fighting styles, which does include karate. Traditional striking martial arts are all kind of in that vein of strike, hold, throw. Very, very little ground fighting, but you could strike a guy, you could hold a guy to strike him, or do chin na, jiu-jitsu holds, and you could throw a guy to the ground. And occasionally we do see ground techniques, and they tend to be, again, fairly immediate grip and rip type techniques, and those sorts of things. So when you look at what we would call like Chinese boxing, Indian boxing, Greek boxing, we see the same pattern over and over and over again. Strike, hold, throw, strike, hold, throw, strike, hold, throw. Different prohibitions in different places. Some allowed the dirty boxing, some didn't. Some allowed kicking, some didn't. Depending on whether it's a competition or street fighting / self-defense, those things, there will be different conventions, right? In China, you have the you had the challenge matches, the Lei Tai matches, and the Beimo matches, right? The dojo storming matches. Same thing in the karate world, right? Self-defense, dojo storming. Really, sport karate didn't come about until much later. And I don't know much about Indian fist fighting systems, but they seem pretty similar to what we see in Chinese. And of course, you can't forget the Khmer boxing systems, the derived ones from Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, whatnot. The Southeast Asian systems, and even systems like Silat, which, even though they're more weapons based and have more grappling in them, still largely striking arts. You see these patterns over and over and over again: strike, hold, throw, strike, hold, throw, strike, hold, throw, strike, hold, throw. Why wouldn't there be so much ground fighting, right? And we saw this in the grappling as well. Why didn't ground fighting come until later? Well, I mean, people can theorize on that, but a lot of it may come down to combat against multiple opponents, where being on the ground restricts your mobility and makes it more dangerous. Weapons might be involved, again, restricting your mobility, making it potentially more dangerous. You might be fighting in crowded public spaces, because remember, streets were not always for vehicles. Streets were traditionally for people, so you could be getting trampled under beasts of burden and people's feet. There's a whole bunch of reasons that you may not want to actually fight on the ground. Never mind the fact that people threw their filth in the streets, and you might not want to be going down and rolling like a pig in shit. So there's a lot of reasons why ground fighting may not have been preferred, may not have been favorable. And again, look at some of the battlefield arts, and going back to the grappling thing, right? Look at Japanese jiu-jitsu, and a lot of that is based in battlefield warfare. And we see the same thing in a lot of the HEMA texts. There's a lot of grappling, there's a lot of wrestling in the sword books, but they're almost always throws, and occasionally you see a move done on the ground, and oftentimes it is to stab somebody, or something of that ilk. There's very, very little ground fighting. And then clearly in England, when we, coming back to prize ring rules and Broughton's rules, there was just kind of maybe a perception of honor, of manliness, of right conduct, of it's really even that old school dominance game thing that we see in wrestling. When you put another man down, you have proven your dominance. Now, if he gets back up and challenges you again, you got to put him down again. But the idea is, like, if you go back to that dominance game, is I put you on the ground, I'm standing above you, I've proven I'm the big dog, I'm the king of the mountain kind of deal. And so we kind of see that pattern over and over and over again. So what we're seeing then, when we consider the term boxing, what we're really talking about then is a fist fight. Now, we got a couple of examples here that I need to talk about, right? The term that we use for boxing when referring to Chinese boxing, right? Because Chinese boxing is not a style, it's categorically Chinese fist fighting martial arts. Why do we use the term boxing? Well, it's kind of an English term. See, the thing is that Chinese martial arts often use the term kun, which is Cantonese, or chuan, which is Mandarin, which just means fist, right? And that, of course, goes back to chuanfa, which is fist law, fist method, that kind of idea. Fighting style, fist, fighting, right? They're just using fist as a proxy for fist fighting. And so the English, when they were in China, were like, oh, it's boxing, right? That's it. So that's why we use the term boxing there, right? If boxing is striking and the Chinese are saying, yes, I'm striking you with a fist, then it's as good as synonymous. So the term boxing is kind of the general term for striking martial arts as opposed to grappling martial arts. And that doesn't mean, just as we see some striking in the grappling martial arts, we are now also seeing some grappling in the striking martial arts. And this is something that I feel, where we had pancrase, we had that kind of grappling platform with some limited striking. I feel like we've had less of that on the striking side. And you can look at left way, which is pretty cool, and that has, you can throw in that, you can headbutt in that one. but you can't do any submissions. Shoot boxing, I believe, allowed some standing submissions, but you had to wear boxing gloves. Sanda, of course, allows throws, but no submissions. Some Lei Tai combat, which is slightly different than Sanda in the rules, will allow some submission work, but again, no ground fighting. So depending on the rule set, there are some options out there, but I feel like we don't have the nice, modernized, clean example that we do with like old rules pancrase, which is almost as perfect as it gets for that. And again, if you have this strike, hold, throw platform, this would be particularly amenable to traditional martial artists who are based on that idea. It's not just kickboxing, it's not pure grappling, it is striking plus grappling. It allows them to kind of apply their skill set as rote, maybe minus some of the dirty boxing, because their safety concerns are what they are. And I think that you could do a lot with that. And even if we look at French boxing, so French boxing wasn't always called French boxing. To my knowledge, Charlemagne is actually the one that kind of coined the term French boxing. Before that, they were literally using the terms savate, old shoe, and chasson, slipper, depending on what region they were coming from. And Charlemagne felt that calling it French boxing was a better idea. And again, they used limited hand striking, much more kicking, and they involved throws, and they involved fighting with the cane and fighting with the great stick. And so again, even in French boxing, which is kicking based, but still also involving hand strikes, they did adopt English boxing in Charlemagne's era. And truth be told, even the originators in the early 1800s were said to have been pretty skilled with their fists. So, whatever the preference was there, is what it is. There may be something to the story that fist fighting was kind of seen as assault with a deadly weapon, so they tried not to do that. But apparently kicking out people's legs wasn't, so whatever. And apparently hitting somebody with a cane wasn't either. So whatever, right? But it was a self-defense based art, a street fighting art that eventually became a sport. And so even then, we're still seeing that strike, hold, throw kind of pattern, just no ground fighting. Over and over and over again, what we're seeing is strike, hold, throw, strike, hold, throw, strike, hold, throw. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Street Fighter and Tekken, the old fighting games, Fatal Fury, King of Fighters. There's a sense of that in those games where, you could be a wrestler and fight against a boxer because you could still grapple with him and throw him to the ground and try to knock him out that way. That's pretty cool, right? And, if you're like a jiu-jitsu guy, traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu guy, you could still try to submit a guy or break his wrist, throw him to the ground, and again, try to knock him out or use your atemi strikes. There are ways that you can make that work, right? And it reminds me of when I was in junior high school, before I actually started my martial arts. I started my martial arts journey about 1 year later. But I remember being in 6th grade, because it was 7th grade when I started doing martial arts. I remember in 6th grade thinking, I want to do Street Fighter, but like for real, right? Just like I said about the pro wrestling thing, right? I wanted to do Street Fighter, but for real. Obviously there's no fireballs, right? There's no touch stuff. There's no magic. But what I don't think I understood then, but I understand now, is like when you look at that, it's not just kickboxing. It's not just boxing. It's not so sportified, but then it's not the same as just MMA. It's kind of a bookend to MMA the way that the pancrase or all-in wrestling would be. So you have all-in wrestling, shoot wrestling on one side, and you have this kind of old platform, it's called all-in boxing or shoot boxing, right, on the other side. And that kind of bookends MMA. So you have striking with limited grappling, you have grappling with limited striking, and then you have MMA, which should be a proper 50-50. And I think that could offer a lot more platform for people to actually be able to apply their skills and make it a lot more amenable to traditional martial artists who have, let's face it, been kind of languishing because either they go, well, the platform, the competition platform doesn't allow me to use my skill set or gives unfavorable weight to another skill set. Well, let's stop complaining and let's start creating ways to fight legally, safely, and still ply our trade. And I think this would be a good platform for it. So yeah, I just want to play Street Fighter for real, man. So I'll end it on that. I will talk with you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share, give the dog a bone. You can follow us on our other social media accounts, and if you really like us, you can head over to Amazon and buy a shirt. You can also go over to Gumroad and purchase some of our instructional courses. All of the links will be provided and also on our website. If you happen to be in the Phoenix area, we would love to meet you. Come drop in for a class, even just to chat. And if you're looking for a new home, we would be happy to have you. So until next time, good journey.